Here and have it completely empty. It's just spring breakers, Easter weekend. It's never this empty.
For the first time, U.S. oil prices fell into the negatives Monday.
Pictures from India, for instance. They can now see the Himalayas from some cities in India for the first time.
Sea turtles on the island. They're actually benefiting from having fewer people around over the past few weeks.
I don't know. It's just very quiet and surreal.
See the mountains in LA. We can see the sky in Boston and New York. And I think now we know how much pollution we were really experiencing before this.
As human activity and the global economy have been driven to a near halt, our planet, of course, continues to turn. Tides rise and fall, plants are growing, energy is coursing through natural systems. In the weeks following shutdown, we have seen anecdotal stories of sudden environmental change related to this pause in business as usual. As scientists, we understand these as observations, not results. Rather than answers, they beg more questions, including questions that we could have never previously studied. What opportunities do we have to understand anthropogenic impact in its very absence? How can this inform our eventual recovery for both environments and economies? A large amount of scientific research conducted today is dedicated to understanding and managing environmental changes related to human activity. Resource extraction, pollution, habitat loss. These variables, driven by economic development, haven't been something we could just remove in order to see what changes. All of a sudden, we have created unintentionally a large-scale natural experiment of anthropogenic impact. In these distressing times, we also have a distinct opportunity, a responsibility even. Just as we rely on modern medicine to address the pandemic, we can turn to modern science as we devise strategies for rebuilding stronger and smarter. And that's precisely what this conversation is about.
Hello, my name is Nancy Knowlton. I'm a scientist emeritus at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I've spent all my career studying coral reefs. The pandemic and the resulting shutdowns have drastically changed many aspects of human behavior. And in particular, it's caused us to withdraw into our homes. We are out and about far less than we were before the shutdowns began. Now, I live in rural Maine where large crowds are unusual even under normal circumstances. And I also spend a lot of my time writing. So in some ways, the changes have been much less dramatic for me than they have been for others. But the changes for the ocean have, in fact, been quite dramatic. We were hearing reports in the news and on social media of animals swimming much close to shore. And with these animals, we're starting to learn that maybe they weren't actually gone altogether, but rather they were just scared of us and in hiding. And learning that has been very positive because it means there is more hope out there, I think, than we realized before. Now, I'm reluctant to call these things silver linings because the tragedies associated with the pandemic have been so enormous that I'm just not comfortable with that language. And I'm also well aware that the changes that we're seeing now are very temporary. People are already anxious to get back to normal and to some extent are getting back to normal. But I do think the pandemic is causing people to rethink how they lived in the past relative to how they might live in the future. This new way of doing business, I think, is going to allow us to think, as the saying goes, how we can rebuild back better. And having made such big changes so quickly gives us the realization that we can make more additional big changes quickly, changes that will be for the good of the planet as well as for ourselves. Getting shoved out of our ruts has opened new paths to a better way of doing things. For example, cities that have shut down streets to cars because of the pandemic, are now thinking about making those shutdowns permanent and having those areas car-free indefinitely. So although we'll for sure return to normal and the familiar to some extent, in fact, we need that familiarity. We need to return to the familiar, I think, in order to heal from this terrible experience we're undergoing. I think we've also gotten a vivid lesson in how fast people can change if they have to or if they want to. And that is very encouraging with respect to the changes we need to make in the future to make the world a more sustainable place.
Hello, my name is Brad Nahill. I'm president of Sea Turtles, a sea turtle conservation organization, talking about how the pandemic has affected sea turtle conservation efforts around the world. We're seeing a lot of headlines that are somewhat sensational about sea turtles coming back because of the pandemic itself. And the situation in reality is a lot more complicated than that. When there are fewer people on the beach and on the water, it's generally a good thing for sea turtles, and we're seeing that in places like Florida. When sea turtles come up onto beaches like that, there are less obstructions for them. They're less likely to get hit by boats, get caught in fishing nets, or to be disturbed by beachfront lighting. However, in a lot of other places where the bigger threat to sea turtles is people collecting the eggs, eating the meat, or using their shells for income or for food, there is increased desperation in a lot of places. And when you combine that with fewer international volunteers and travelers that keep people out on the beach and are eyes on the beach to help protect these turtles, we are seeing increased numbers of eggs being collected, of turtles being hunted. In terms of long-term benefits from this, really one good nesting season with few obstructions on a beach where there's generally a lot of people is probably not going to have a long-term impact positively on sea turtle populations. Where there is a possibility of some real positive long-term impact is in the research that's done on these nesting beaches so that we can compare how well turtles do with people and without people. And hopefully we learn those lessons and can implement changes in rules and regulations and people's behavior over the long term in ways that are beneficial for sea turtles. The other thing that I'm hoping that comes out of this, and this isn't a prediction in any way, we really don't know if this is going to happen or not, but if people change the way that they travel and move away from things like cruise ships towards more meaningful vacations where you can volunteer with wildlife, visit conservation projects, leave money behind, and become actively involved in changing the way that you travel, that can also have a really important long-term benefit for these animals.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Gonçalves. I'm a marine conservationist, a director and chief scientist at the Oceanic Foundation, and a researcher and professor of marine biology and conservation at Mare ISPA in Lisbon, Portugal. All of a sudden, everything changed. Everything came to a halt with this pandemic. Our freedom became limited, our economies plunged, our loved ones are isolated, our jobs are at risk or deeply disturbed. And at the same time, we see clear skies above our cities. We see animals expanding their home ranges, both in land and at sea. Luckily, in many countries, leaders are choosing to save lives. But in other situations, we see the leaders trying to jump back to normal as soon as possible. What is normal today? Normal is polluting the skies and seas, is destroying nature, is harming the most vulnerable, is increasing inequality, and not respecting individual choices and differences. And so I say, we need a new normal. We need to rebuild the planet and change our economic model. One of the solutions that we know works are marine protected areas that are fully or highly protected. They are banks of natural capital that have many times more fish and allow fish to grow bigger. Bigger fish move around and also have more babies. This way, these fully or highly protected MPAs increase fishing revenues outside these areas. They also help create jobs and protect the blue natural capital that the biotechnology industry depends upon. But currently, only 5.3% of the ocean is protected in implemented and actively managed MPAs. One of the dangers of the current situation is countries opting to opening up these few MPAs that work to industrial fishing. The quest for short-term economic gains was what brought us here. Repeating the same mistake would be tragic. It would be the same as selling the Statue of Liberty or dismantling the Golden Gate for profit. The deeply disturbing situation that we are living today demonstrates that we need to change. We deserve change. Our economic systems are not prepared to protect citizens from the effects of this pandemic. Previous generations could claim that they didn't know best. Well, we don't have that option anymore. If we continue our way, it's because we choose to do so. The good news is that not only science is going to find a response to this pandemic, but also science has the solutions for both the climate emergency and the species extinction crisis. The Oceano Azul Foundation, together with 26 other foundations, NGOs, representatives of indigenous peoples, and fishers, have launched the campaign Rise Up for the Ocean. Let's rally together, let's rebuild nature, restructure our economies, and heal ourselves.
Hello, I'm Heather Zichal, the Executive Director of the Blue Prosperity Coalition. We are a network of scientists, philanthropists, and NGOs working together with international governments to protect the ocean and build economies at the same time. Before taking this position, I served as a lead climate advisor for President Obama. Now, a lot of people ask, what was the path from the White House to the work I'm doing today? But in fact, it was actually a pretty natural transition to go from working for the United States president to tackle climate to working globally with presidents around the world that are committed to protecting our oceans. As everybody knows, you can't have a sustainable ocean policy without a sustainable climate policy, and vice versa. In our world, we're still doing a lot in figuring out how to move forward. Virtual summits, rethinking planning. I am actually pretty encouraged that we are able to get so much done via Zoom, and we're trying to really be responsive to our partners around the world. Globally, COVID-19's impact on tourism may amount to a $7.4 billion loss and could put 75 million jobs at risk. Maritime shipping has seen COVID-19 associated drops in activity of up to 30% in some regions. Lockdowns and reduced demand for seafood have seen fishing activity fall by as much as 80% in China and West Africa. Additionally, 3 billion people around the world rely on oceans for their primary source of protein, as well as livelihoods. Many of our partners rely on fishing exports and licenses for revenue. In partner countries like the Azores off the coast of Portugal, fishers are no longer able to export. In other countries like the Maldives, where most of the population relies on imported food, they might rely more heavily on locally caught seafood. It goes without saying there are new challenges, including enforcing MPAs and preventing illegal and unregulated fishing during this time. So while we take this pause and deal with the incredible hardships that the world is facing during the pandemic, how can we step back and see the bigger picture and continue to fight for nature, for people, for biodiversity, and for climates? The silver lining here is that healthy oceans can actually be a solution for a lot of global problems: food security, economic stability, and even potential cures for viruses and diseases can be found in the ocean. Just like fixing the pandemic, Protecting our oceans needs to be a global effort. No one country can solve this alone. The time is now for planning the blue economy, sustainable development, fisheries management that works directly with fishers, addressing local impacts, as well as blue research. While no one knows the real long-term effects that COVID-19 will have on the world, what we do know is that economic development doesn't need to be in opposition of nature. It is imperative that we work together to shift our perspectives and do the work to build a stronger blue world. It won't be easy, but our future depends on it.
Hello, I am NASA astronaut and Scripps Institution of Oceanography alum, Jessica Meir. I recently returned from a 7-month mission on board the International Space Station, and this perspective was quite an interesting one for me since I returned very recently to an entirely different planet than the one that I left. And of course, in that instance, I am talking about the global pandemic of COVID-19. When I launched from Kazakhstan in a Soyuz spacecraft back in September, we really hadn't heard anything about this disease. But all of this situation unfolded while I was up there in orbit around the Earth. It was truly a stark contrast to watch the news, to talk to our family and friends, and to see what was happening, because the Earth looked equally as stunning as it ever did from our vantage point on the International Space Station. It was very surreal for us to understand what was happening as well, since we were still going about completely our normal routine. So that is the interesting situation. We were only 3 of the 7.5 billion humans that were not affected by this global pandemic. Everybody else down there was affected in some way, whether it was from unfortunately ending up with the disease themselves or knowing someone that did, or even just having their daily routine altered. Everybody was really affected by this except for the 3 of us that were up on the space station. And that was really difficult for us to comprehend. Since we were up there going through our normal routine and supporting all of the daily tasks, the scientific experiments that were going on the space station, as well as all the maintenance and daily activities, we still carried out our days. Now, of course, that's not to be said that the lives of everybody on the ground team was incredibly affected, just like everybody else on the Earth. NASA put in force all these different protocols to make sure to keep all of the ground personnel safe. We were operating out of 2 different control rooms in the Johnson Space Center and that kind of thing. So a real testament to how NASA rose to the challenge and had to adapt to the times. But interestingly, that transition was seamless for us, and that was something else that made it even more difficult to digest what was really happening back on Earth, because we were very busy going through our normal operations and not even having time to process everything that happened. When we landed, we truly returned to a completely different planet from the time that that hatch opened and we saw all of the people with masks on ready to pull us out. And from that moment, we've had to adapt to life back here on Earth and an entirely different time. So it was certainly a unique perspective that I had from the space station.
Well, thank you very much for all that. Those were wonderful videos. This is now the opportunity that we look forward to, the discussion about where do we go from here. I'm going to kick this off with a general question, and I'd like to put that out there to ask the question of how can these observed changes that we have inform us of a way that we rethink and we rebuild? Emmanuel, I'm going to ask you to answer that first, as you touched on that in your video.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. Well, I think there are 3 lessons that we can take from the current situation. One very important one is that humans and nature are one. We have considered ourselves superior to nature. We have considered our economies superior to the natural systems. But what we are seeing quite clearly is that we are completely dependent on the planet, on nature, and interdependent from it. The second lesson is that change is possible. And so we can change our ways. I don't know if we are going to do it, but you know, we have the tools to do it, and we don't need to have a development model that is based on the destruction of the planet. And I think this is also something that came out, I hope can come out of the crisis and all the thinking that is around the situation where we are. And finally, I think the third topic that I would like to, the third lesson that I would like to highlight is that we cannot claim anymore that we don't know. So we know, we knew about a pandemic such as this could come out. We know the causes of it, and we haven't prepared to it. And so we have the science that alert us that the crises that we are living are based in our ways, and there are different ways to do things. And we also have the science to show us what change needs to happen in order for us to have a much more sustainable way of living with the planet and not against the planet.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna take a question here from Jay Huckins. I'm gonna ask you, Heather, how can we talk about the climate and the world's oceans to people who care more about money and the economy in a way that will cause them to change?
Excellent question, and very topical. You know, I actually think the dialogue that we're seeing today about, you know, this discussion about what is the connection between humans and nature, and as we are in a post-coronavirus world, what do we want that future to look like? You know, and I agree with everything Nancy said in her video. It's a very difficult time to find encouragement, but what you know, what keeps me going is the fact that, you know, on any given day, you wake up to, you know, the Germans calling for recovery programs to invest in future-proof jobs that reduce emissions for our planet. Britain called for accelerating the acceleration of greener technologies. We're talking about mangrove restoration and investing in carbon sinks in our ocean. You have diverse countries from Pakistan to Portugal, Canada, and the United Arab Emirates, all talking about the need for a green and blue recovery. The World Bank, major global investors, which represent over $55 trillion in assets, have warned governments to avoid short-term big emitting projects when they're backing growth, because the opportunity with jobs, you know, with cleaner solutions, not only creates jobs, but also has the co-benefits for the climate and for clean air. So I'm actually very encouraged that we are, you know, finding these toeholds with governments, with corporations, with global investors. And I think the path forward is to really, you know, support those efforts and help continue to connect the links between humans and nature and what we need to do to recover for the future.
Great, thanks very much, Heather. Brad, we have a question for you from Sanj Sanghani. He asks, if we already know turtles will thrive on closed beaches, how are we exploring exactly how much they've actually been affected and how much their numbers are growing today?
Okay, so in terms of how much they're growing, the trends that we're seeing in sea turtles, a lot of places, there's a number of populations that have been growing, but that has been a 20 or 30 year trend in a lot of places. You know, it's way too soon to tell if any numbers of sea turtles are growing right now because of the pandemic. It's unlikely that, you know, new sea turtles are coming to nest because of beaches that were closed. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
It was how exploring how they've been affected and how will the numbers grow. So getting at the effects and then the nursery elements that you were pointing out.
Yeah, so the effects really kind of depend on where they are. In places where too many people is the biggest problem for sea turtles, effects have really declined quite a bit. And I'm expecting to see in the next year lots of research coming out about, how behavior may have changed in different places if turtles are nesting more in certain spots that have less beachfront lighting, for example, things like that. But yeah, in places where people are still eating the eggs or eating the turtle meat and things like that, without international volunteers that help cover long stretches of beach and things like that, it's really tough. A lot of projects are really hurting for both manpower and funding to be able to protect those beaches. But hopefully the impacts, the negative impacts, will be limited to one nesting season, which over the long term is not going to wipe out any species.
Right. Yeah, that brings me to a question linked to the endeavor, Nancy, that you've been well embroiled in, the Earth optimism events, starting with Ocean Optimism, and you did this to make us remember what we love about the ocean and the things, the good stories that are there. What you recently hosted an Earth Optimism Summit. What would you personally highlight that makes you feel optimistic in spite of, or maybe even building from, the unique times that we're in right now? You're on mute.
I've spent almost a decade collecting stories of success in ocean conservation, and I did it because I started doing it because I realized that just talking about all the problems without talking about the solutions was going to ultimately make people discouraged and tune out and become less engaged, which is exactly the opposite of what I wanted to have happen. And then I also at the same time discovered that there were many more of these success stories out there than I realized, and that in fact even marine conservation professionals who you'd think would be pretty aware of what positive things were happening as a result of their efforts were often actually completely unaware of amazing successes. And so I think this pandemic is going to teach us more things along those lines. I mean, in addition to the Earth Optimism Summit, I was involved in a recent research effort documenting the potential for marine life to recover between now and 2050. And one of the things that we learned in the process of creating this study was that there are actually big examples of success associated with similar kinds of pauses. In particular, the collapse of fishing effort between during World War II resulted in a real rebound in fish numbers. So I think this pause is going to be much shorter, but that particular example and many others have illustrated that if we do things properly in terms of marine conservation, recovery can be actually pretty quick. In fact, some of the best examples are from the turtles that Brad was talking about. I mean, some of the nesting numbers have just been extraordinary, and it's been documented that now most populations of sea turtles are actually on the road to recovery, which is again something that a lot of people don't know, but is a well-documented scientific finding.
Thank you, Nancy. Jessica, we have a question from Katie Mikukoshi asking, and which builds off of what Nancy's getting at, these stories of success that are across the globe, and us trying to think about institutionalizing it. The question is if it'd be great to know if there's some ways that NASA is contributing to a sustainable environment. I know that you contributed quite a bit to our love of the marine environment with your surf break image gallery, which I think is one of the most popular things here in San Diego. But if you don't mind addressing that.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we do is events like this one and the outreach that we do while we're on board the International Space Station for our missions at NASA. And I think sharing those kind of images and sharing that perspective is first of all very important. I wish that I could share that and have every human's eyes actually present in space, because I really do think once you've seen it with your own eyes, for the multitudes if everybody could actually see that image and how it looks and how it feels, and really transforms your perspective, and really understanding how precious the earth is and how tenuous that thin band of an atmosphere is, and seeing that it truly is this blue gem, this blue planet beneath, it really does transform your perspective. Now, I know, of course, all the members of this board have been doing this type of research because they've already believed in all of these, in the power of conservation and the power of protecting, the need to protect our planet. But I think that that could be a powerful image to share with everybody on Earth. And I think it really could help the standpoint that our world leaders have. NASA also does a lot of other Earth observation type platforms. Does the International Space Station even has many scientific instruments on it, looking at things as sea surface temperatures, measuring chlorophyll levels, all kinds of remote sensing platforms that I think people are pretty familiar with, but that does exist on the space station as well as measuring different things in our atmosphere, aerosols, cloud formation, lots of different variables of pollution. So even the ISS, a human platform, does serve to provide a lot of that data set and knowledge. And then, of course, there are many, many other NASA satellites as well that aren't connected with the space station program that do contribute to that data set that we have.
Thank you very much. Now, I know we said we wouldn't do this, but there's a question from Daniel Kleinman addressed to Heather or Emmanuel. So we're going to have to fight to see who gets this one. What role do you see innovation and entrepreneurship playing in coming back from COVID to better our interaction with the ocean?
Do you want to start, Emmanuel?
Okay, I can start.
Okay, I'll back clean up.
Well, I think that what we are seeing today is an amazing international effort from science to come up with a quick fix to this problem. And this shows the collaborative nature that science and the power that science can have when the effort is the right one and is directed to the problems that we're trying to face in a strong way. I think I would say the strongest way ever that I've seen. And this is a very important lesson for the sustainability issues that we have been discussing. So it's just a matter of will and leadership. We can do it. We have the brains, we have the capacities, we have the power, we have the networks. We are one of the advantages of this globalized world is that, we know exactly what's happening in almost every corner of the world today because we are connected. And so the power that science can bring from this crisis to this particular solution, if applied to the issues that we are facing in terms of the climate and the biodiversity challenges. And as Nancy was pointing out, we have good stories, so we know what works. We can do it. It's just a matter of us rallying together and going and using science for this. I would say that this is probably the most powerful lesson from this crisis, is having this amazing and intensive international effort for a very, very complicated issue, which is a pandemic. It is a virus that doesn't, our body is not prepared to receive. And so there's lots of complications on the process and lots of hard work behind it. But things that used to take months or even years are now being strongly compressed. And I think this is a very powerful and inspiring lesson from the situation where we are, which is very worrisome, but at the same time give us hope that we can do it.
And I think you're 1,000% spot on, Emmanuel. The only thing that I might add is, one of the really important, another important lesson learned is just the important role that science has played in policy and decision making. COVID has us scrambling to respond to a crisis that could have been eased if political leaders had heeded some of the scientific, some of the warnings from the scientists and acted sooner. And, as somebody who's spent over 20 years working on climate policy, that sounds awfully familiar to me. But, I think making sure that we are, I think there's an important role that we are seeing in and recognizing now, which is that science has to help guide these decisions, not only today, but for the future as well.
Great, thanks very much. Brad, building from that, you've highlighted the value and the opportunity of new markets, especially ecotourism, to help us rebuild smarter and stronger. Can you share some successful experiences in your efforts to connect economic development with achieving and sustaining real-world conservation goals?
Sure, absolutely. One of the big things that we try to do related to turtle watching is in a lot of the communities where the turtles come to lay their eggs, there's a history of people eating the eggs. A lot of towns, especially in places like the Caribbean, that were created to catch turtles, to collect their eggs, their shells, and their on exploiting the turtles as a resource for generations. So how do we as conservationists help figure out ways to help provide alternatives for people to stop eating the eggs? Tourism is a great one. In a lot of cases, the people who live in these communities know more about the patterns of the sea turtles and the history of the turtles in that area, and they can be tremendous guides or patrollers. So, I've seen in places like Costa Rica where when I first went there in '99, I went to a community on the Caribbean coast, and there was no conservation program, although they had nesting leatherbacks there. And within a few years, they learned about some other communities along the coast that were bringing student groups and travelers, and they implemented a program. They were doing homestays where people could stay, with a local family. And those experiences ended up benefiting more than 30 or 40% of that community. And there's very little alternatives, banana plantations, fishing, to that. And so, in a relatively short period of time, I've seen communities like this one's place called Paris Mina transform from one being based on eating the turtles and eating the eggs to, bringing people in and surviving in a way that helps the community and the turtles themselves thrive.
Yeah, that's great. And continuing on this theme of more ways to get different industries and different cross-sections of society involved in the solutions, it's a question from Dale Steele to Nancy. The question is there a general public outreach plan to engage, inform, and involve politicians and decision makers to keep us from just going back to the old ways of handling the environment?
It's interesting that you asked that question. I was just on a call with the Blue Frontier folks who are thinking exactly about that, how to connect constituents to decision makers and allow them to communicate their desire to repair the economy and repair the planet at the same time. So I think there are a lot of small NGOs, big NGOs that are working along those lines. But I also think it's really important to engage the public that isn't part of the conservation choir. So there's a section of people who are in love with the ocean, know it's in danger, and are working actively. But a lot of people are still not necessarily on that page, or even if they realize that the ocean's facing problems, they don't know what they can do. So that's really been part of what drove the Twitter campaign, the hashtag Ocean Optimism, which has now been used by over 45,000 different accounts, from people, just regular citizens, to the Huffington Post and the World Bank. And so the purpose of that was to just make it easier for people to find examples of what was working and be inspired by them, maybe take those examples and try to replicate them or scale them up. So I think it's not only reaching policymakers, but also engaging many more people in this effort. At the Smithsonian, we like to say that we need to reach 1 billion people to make this work. And, we're not quite at 1 billion yet, but we're moving in that direction, I guess I'd say.
That's excellent.
Can I just?
And one of them. Yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
Can I just? I think I agree with everything Nancy said, but there's one really, really important way to engage with politicians, and that's at the ballot box. So I know, we're all from around the world here, but voting is the #1 way you get politicians to pay attention. Sorry.
And the #2 way is to spend time in space talking with some people across the globe, Jessica. I did see you on Stephen Colbert, and that was pretty phenomenal. I watched your microphone flip. Don't worry. I've got a couple questions for you. The first one comes from Nora and Rebecca. They are ages 4 and 8. I reversed the order. Nora, I believe, is 8. Asking, how did your knowledge of the oceans help you as an astronaut?
Well, I think my knowledge of anything scientifically related helped me up there on the International Space Station. And that's really the skills that we acquire as a scientist in terms of thinking and solving a problem using the scientific method. That helped us in everything that we did, really, in problem solving in general. And of course, since when we are up there looking down, most of the time when we look out of the window, we see the oceans. So seeing that, one of my favorite things to see out of the window were the ocean currents, and especially along coastlines. You could very clearly see the efflux, you could see river waters, you could see the convergence zones and the river deltas. And that was one of the most beautiful things that I took photographs of were those coastal areas and the differences in the ocean waters. Even some of my favorite photos were of the frozen ocean currents in the North Atlantic. Really striking images, and seeing that from that perspective is something really different. Seeing that all of these geologic features on the planet from space is so unique, because you can understand more about how all of the things on our planet formed. For example, volcanism or previous lava flows. If you see that from the space station, it's very clear to see where you have this past flow. Whereas if you were on the Earth standing in the middle of it, you might not see it because it would be so extensive that all the land around you is quite similar. So it really does offer this unique perspective to help us understand a lot more about our planet.
And it's great having an ocean advocate in space. I think there's nothing better. One more question for you from coming from the Galapagos, from Nicholas Moidy, for you, Jessica. It said that the biodiversity hotspots like the Amazon or the ocean areas are less contaminated than the sky above big cities. And this is visible from space. Could Jessica see any difference from space above big cities and highly contaminated places during the beginning of the pandemic while she was in the space station? That difference between the Galapagos and cities.
We were asked that question many times, and unfortunately, since our orbit is precessing, we have we're not passing over the same spot at the same time every day. So it's a little bit difficult with just the naked eye to really observe some of these phenomenon. But I think several things would be visible if we had the time and had the plans to do such a systematic observation. If we compared some of these photographs from the same spot, then I think we would easily be able to see some of those differences in pollution and smog, definitely in terms of how many aircrafts were flying in the highly dense areas. We can see the contrails very easily from space. We can see the difference in the large shipping ports as well. It actually is one of our big projects on the space station. We do Earth observation photos regularly. I took several photos, for example, of the Patagonia ice fields. And we actually use these decades of astronaut images over time from the same perspective to help monitor things like the retreat of those glaciers. So I think that would be a great idea. Somebody, wish that we'd had the foresight to do that, to have those systematic observations. But unfortunately, I don't have the data to support that. But I do know that we would be able to see those phenomenon from space.
I've got a thick question, and then from Orion McCarthy, and this one's directed to all. I may direct it I'll see if somebody elects. Even with the massive changes in human behavior brought about by the pandemic, global emissions are only projected to drop by about 4 to 7% this year. What does this mean for the role of individual behavioral change versus societal structural change for addressing climate issues? The first one off mute gets it. Otherwise, I'm going to call. Nancy, will you take a stab at that? Yeah.
Sure. I was just trying to find my mute button. Actually, the most recent data I saw just today was that the drop was 17%. So it's a little bit bigger. But I share that questioner's, that was my immediate thought when I saw the initial numbers, and even 17%. When you think about the fact that we're the dramatic nature of the shutdown, and yet it isn't really enough to even get us back to where we need to head for the 2016 Paris Agreement, does indicate that we need systematic change, that you can't do this all by yourself, individual by individual. There's some things that governments can do that can greatly accelerate the transition to a carbon neutral economy. So, but that said, I don't think it's also the case that, what individuals do doesn't matter. And I think it's not only that you make a contribution, but you communicate your determination to solve the problem to your friends and neighbors and family and to the political leaders that you communicate with. So I think it's both a bottom up and a top down process. But yes, those numbers are a bit daunting when you realize how many changes we've made in the last couple of months and how many more we will still have to make to really get to be a carbon neutral planet.
Okay, and we're going from the biggest scale down to the local scale here, as Nancy pointed out that spectrum. So from Alexandra Lago to Brad, how will you brought up some of the challenges, economic challenges that we're seeing at this local scale. How will small local NGOs deal with this shortage of funds and possibly shortage of volunteers to help with the work?
You cut out right in the middle of the question.
Yeah. How will small local NGOs deal with the shortage of funds and possibly of volunteers to help with work? And do you have ideas of how to mitigate that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Right when this whole thing hit, the International Sea Turtle Symposium was supposed to be happening in Colombia, and they ended up canceling it right beforehand. And I was scheduled to give a talk about fundraising to the sea turtle community during this symposium. And so I said, all right, well, people are going to need it more than ever. So I ended up giving one to a couple hundred people, and some of the things that I was suggesting was, looking for sponsors. There seems to be an increase, and I think this is a positive thing, in cause marketing. Brands that save an animal for every purchase, things like that. I think a lot of NGOs can take advantage of. Tourism is going to be something that's going to impact organizations for, who knows how long. So the ones that are dependent on that, are finding it really tough right now. So in those cases, my advice is to diversify your funding sources to try to build up individual donors, things like that. My organization, one of the things that we do is support turtle nesting beaches around the world, and we created an emergency fund where we're raising funds to help provide some, quick impact to some of these projects that are, finding themselves at a real loss right now. But there's no great answers, but yeah, trying to help as much as we can.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Emmanuel, we have a question from Nicole Lobazinski. She asks, we know that climate change will disproportionately affect traditionally vulnerable and underrepresented populations, especially coastal communities. And we've seen that COVID is disproportionately affecting people of color. We'd love to hear your perspective on how we can move forward centering equity and social justice in marine conservation and broader policies.
Wow. Okay, that's a big one.
It is.
But I'm not going to duck. I say I think it's one of the consequences of our current economic model is that we are increasing the injustice, we are increasing the vulnerability of coastal peoples, and we are increasing the gap between the different layers of society. And so if we continue our ways, this is what we're going to get. So the good news is that we know the result. We know that if we continue in progressing this way, inequality is going to increase, more people are going to be hurt. Although we are solving also some problems, we know that hunger has gone down, we know that there are health issues that have also been solved, but the fundamental change that needs to happen is in our economic model. And the question is, how can this economic model incorporate this interlink between humans and nature? How can nature be valued in the economic model so that we are driven to protect it rather than to destroy it? Because if we protect nature, we are protecting the livelihoods of people. So we are increasing social justice. We are bringing this resilience to the social system because we have more natural capital. We have more capacity to do so. So I think the fundamental thing here is understanding that if we continue to destroy the planet, these problems are going to be worse and they are not going to be less. And so we need to change also our ways, and mainly we need to change our relationship between humans and nature through the economic system. The economic system has to be the driver of the solutions, and the only way to do it is to have, if you want, a clear red line. On one side, you can have the activities that destroy nature, that pollute or carbonize, and on the other side, you have to have the activities that decarbonize, the activities that have social justice, etc. And those have to be on different layers of investment. Those have to be on different layers of receiving attention from the society and from the political system. So I think the real issue here is understanding that without recovering the planet, we're going to end up in having more problems. And that's an additional reason why we need to do this, why we need to have this change in the climate landscape, but also we need to understand that we have a crisis on species extinction. We are destroying nature everywhere and in the ocean as well. And so we have to use the tools that we have to reverse this trend. And the economy is a big part of this.
Great, thank you. And I recognize that we've hit the 1 hour that we had originally arranged. We still have some questions, and we still we've rented this venue for longer than 1 hour. So we're going to ask about 5 to 10 more minutes of questions and then close. Thank you, panelists, for the extra time. We'll buy you dinner when we can see you again. There's a question, Heather, for you from Jesslyn Mendowski, asking, I see this pandemic as so clearly showing us that our economic systems are not resilient enough. How do we start to change these systems to be more adaptable to future change? How can we learn resilience from our natural systems, which have been adapting to change over time?
I think that's a great question, and I'd love to tell you that I'm sitting here today. I have the answer, but I think we are in this very unique moment in time where everybody, like the world has significantly changed, and again, with change comes opportunity to look at how are we living, how do we need to change. How do we, as Emmanuel talked about, how do we change our relationship with nature? And I I am encouraged because as I talked about previously, you have countries, you have major global investors, you know, the World Bank, et cetera, all, you know, I think trying to be really creative about how we recover after in a post coronavirus world. And you know, I think you see more interest in trying new and different things, right? Like there's some really interesting conversations happening around mangrove restoration, coral reef restoration, and the job opportunities afforded there. You're seeing government step up and provide additional funding for you know, for a lot of the blue and green components of recovery. But I think we're going to have to try a lot of things before we sort of nail it. And I think we're going to have to continue to be really entrepreneurial because, you know, nobody saw this coming. And whether it's how do you help, you know, small island developing states that require that rely so heavily on tourism, what does that recovery look like? You know, that's going to be very different than what we're dealing with in the United States. And how do we think like very big picture about resilient economies and resilient environments? And you know, I think it's going to be part of a growing and ongoing dialogue. And I think, you know, I think the good and the bad news is we are going to have to try and do a lot of different things before we figure out the answer to this really important question.
Jessica, you spent quite a bit of time, I would imagine, musing over how things are changing, and we do know that we have our ocean advocate in you. I'm curious about your perspective on how can the public contribute to ocean conservation and management for the future when you see the big blue marble below you, when you see the different scale, where do you see the role of science? Where do you see the role of observation in helping us think about a tomorrow that's different?
Well, I think first of all, the perspective that I was afforded on the space station that we are so fortunate to have is that it is very, very easy for us to see from up there that we truly are all in this together. And I said that a lot before this pandemic in terms of the conservation effort. It's so easy to see that all of the Earth's inhabitants, that we truly are one species. We don't see those man-made boundaries from above. And you can feel that palpably and personally that we are in this together. And that is equally as true about this pandemic, exactly the same meaning. And so it's really a multifaceted statement, and I use it in that way now. I think really it's for everybody, like the panelists have been saying many times here tonight, how important the use of the science and the data that we are collecting in government organizations like NASA, through all of the research organizations that all the panelists represent. We need to use that science in order to inform the policy and to inform that change. I like how Heather brought up the point about voting. That is something that every individual can do, and a very important responsibility that we all have that can bring forth this kind of change. And I like to challenge people just to try to think of one thing, one small thing that they can do. Sometimes people think that one of their efforts may be futile when you look at the global scale, but I really don't think that is true if everybody pitches in some way in which they can make a difference, whether that is to sustain some of these practices that have been forced upon them from this pandemic in terms of using their bicycle a little bit more, or cutting down on some emissions on a personal level, or looking at other things they can do just to recycle and use less plastic. All of these things really can make a difference. And so I encourage people to try to think globally and to remember that we truly are all in this together.
And Nancy, I have to end with you, out of, if nothing else, out of respect for the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation that you formed here, that I currently try to keep up with. and the having created the training program that created the founders of Salty Cinema, all alums of the Scripps Master of Advanced Studies in Marine Biodiversity and Conservation program. You created a legacy here. You got your next person who wants some inspiration from you, and this is Heather, and she's asking, how can we at home, or me as a high schooler, help encourage environmentally friendly ways?
Well, you know, Catherine Hayhoe, who I consider to be a great communicator about climate change, always says when she's asked that question, what's the most important thing you can do? She says, talk about it. In other words, you can do a lot of stuff individually, but you can take what you do and multiply it 10, 20, 100-fold by just going out there and talking to everyone you know about why you care and what you're doing and whether that person might join you or do something on their own to make a difference. I mean, if we just sit there and quietly do things by ourselves, we're much less powerful than we are if we do things together and visibly, vocally together. I think if I have to say, the thing that gives me the most optimism about the future is the extent to which young people are doing exactly that. They are really in our face, and it's great. And I really appreciate the fact that they won't let us get away with this. So, you know, so you have, as a person in high school, you have enormous power on your own, but with your friends and your age to organize. You have these amazing technologies available to take your word and make your word spread literally around the world. I have to say, enormously impressed by what young people have accomplished in the last 5 years, and very, very hopeful that they will actually fundamentally change the way the world operates, and in a very good way.
Can't think of a better note than that to end on. I want to take a moment just to thank the 5 of you for participating today. This has been an incredible conversation. It's an incredible group, and the work that each of you does is part of the inspiration that keeps us all moving. It's great to hear some stories today for us to start building a perspective towards tomorrow. So I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank the organizers of the Salty Cinema program. The team that you saw in the opening video are heroes in their own right, and have pulled together what I believe is a great format. Please stay in touch, everyone, with Salty Cinema, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and each of the organizations involved trying to think about tomorrow and find better solutions. With that, I want to thank you all. I want to encourage you to stay healthy, stay safe, find community around you, and let's get out of this together. Thank you all.
Thank you.